Tonight, I am doing my two rival sets, my East and West Elite Explanation set live stream here. And I think people are going to find it very, very interesting because I'm going to explain how they both came to be. And it's pretty intricate because there's a lot of dates that very key things occurred that are important in the context of how I'm going to lay this out. Um, because there's an Eastern and a Western set, there's different things that overlap insofar as what one did in their dealings with the other, and so on and so forth. I had to lay this out in such a way to where people can stick with it and it'll make the most sense to people. But before I get started, I'm going to give people time to sort of filter in here because I know a lot of people had actually wanted to listen to this. It is going to be a good live because I think it's important that people understand that there are indeed two different separate sets of elites and that the world isn't just run by one pair of elites or one small group of elites or whatever, what have you. No, there's two different sets of elites, and people need to know that. And I'm going to show how that is the reality here. So I'm going to let people get in here. Let's see who's in here right now. Nope, I don't see anybody chatting. Well, either way, so what I had done was I had started in ancient times and I really went way back, even as far back as like the before Common Era times, with the Greek Minoans and the Chinese Xia dynasty, respectively. And then I went into the Roman period and the Qin period when you saw the birth of the unified Chinese Empire during the Qin dynasty, the Q-I-N dynasty. There's also a Qing dynasty, but the Qing dynasty and Qin dynasty are two different dynasties during the Chinese Empire. The Chinese Empire was perhaps the longest single living empire in the history of the world because it stretched officially from, if you're not looking at the 221 date, if you're actually going all the way back to the first dynasty of the Xia dynasty, you're looking at a time period of 2070 or 2070 BCE all the way up to 1912, which is an extremely long time for a civilization to stretch, as far as an actual empire of different dynasties. But a unified Chinese empire wasn't actually established until the Qin dynasty in 221 BC. So, yeah, and then I also went back into Russia's history and I looked at their rather unique mix of different civilizations and how they all sort of coalesced into what became the Russian people. It was a mix of the ancient Scythian people that inhabited much of the area, which is now Russia, and also parts of Central Asia, the Caucasus. There were the Scythians. Then there were later the Huns and the Mongols and then the early Slavs and the Varangians, which the Varangians were actually a Nordic people that came from Scandinavia, like what you would consider Vikings. They sailed down the Volga River and also into the rivers of what is now Ukraine, and like the Don River, and and southern Russia, and they established their their kingdoms there, which became the Kievan Rus, which then turned into Russia, what we know as the Russian Empire. So, Russia has an interesting history with its patchwork of different peoples that had mixed to create what is now Russia, you know. So I looked at a lot of the West as well. I looked at the Roman Empire was where a lot of things really, picked up for the West because uh, in the first century AD, you had really the Kabbalah become a thing, and the Kabbalah is a big part of the origins of many of the Western secret societies, as well as the Catholic Church. But I'll go into all that as soon as I really get started with all of this. This will be an interesting. This will be an interesting layout here. Again, this was kind of difficult to do from the standpoint of actually sorting all the information out in the best way I could, the most coherent way I could. You have to understand when you're looking at all these different dates and you're looking at all these different entities, like these different civilizations and how they became nations and how they all interacted with each other, it becomes a little challenging to actually like lay all these things out in a way that makes any sort of sense as far as dates and how the dates all align and they intersect and everything. It's a challenge, but I managed to lay it out in such a way to where I think it'll make sense to a lot of people. I hope it makes sense to a lot of people. Again, a lot of this is stuff I already knew. Some of it was a little newer information, but most of it I had already known, but I didn't know quite really how to like lay it all out for people. So I'm going to do the best I can with this. I know a lot of people have been wanting to hear this, so here it is. I'm going to go ahead and get started. See, there's only 4 people in the room. Wow. Wow. Okay. So you have the Greek Minoans, which originated on the island of Crete, and they had been around from 2700 to BC to 1450 BC, and then you had the mainland Greek city-states that had been around from 2800 BC to 2100 BC, and then you had the Macedonian Empire, which was a Greek empire. It was basically Alexander the Great's empire and his successor states when it broke into 4 different sub-empires at his death, which that lasted from 776 BC to 323 BC. Then after that, or I should say about around the same time, you had the birth of the Roman Empire, because just before, or I should say just right after that, 27 BC was really the birth of the Roman Empire. I mean, Rome had been around way before then, but it did not become really an empire until 27 BCE or BC. And then it lasted until 1453 AD with the Eastern Roman Empire, which then became the Byzantine Empire. I'm sure you've all heard the name Byzantine before. The Byzantine Empire was what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was largely in the Balkans and their holdings in the Middle East, and also what was in Egypt, but they eventually lost that. The Byzantine Empire lost a lot of territory in the Middle Ages. So, as for China, you had the Xia dynasty in 2070 BC, running until 1600 BC. And then you had other dynasties that followed. But in 221 BC was when the Qin dynasty unified all of China into a unified greater Chinese empire. So they had their empire about that time. And as for Russia, you had a mix of the ancient Scythian peoples. Then later you had the Huns, and then the later Mongolian peoples who followed the Huns. The Huns came before the Mongols. The Mongols came in later, and that was more in the Middle Ages, in the medieval times. And then you had the early Slavs, and you had the Varangians, which were basically a Nordic Viking people who had settled, they had immigrated into the area, and you also had Turkic peoples and Persian peoples who all intermixed to create what became the Russian Empire. At first, it was called the Kievan Rus, which it was officially founded in 862 A.D., but it was called Kievan Rus in 988 A.D., but its founding came years earlier, decades earlier, in 862 A.D. So, you had then further immigration of the Finnic peoples from Finland and, the early Slavs, everything. They all intermixed to create the Russian Empire, what became Russian Empire. So, in the West, you had, out of the Roman Empire, you had Emperor Decius legalizing Christianity in order that, this was after Nero and other emperors had persecuted Christians for so long. You had Emperor Decius legalizing Christianity in the Roman Empire in order that Christians could be drafted into the Roman army, into the Roman legions. And many of them did. Many of them did go on to fight for Rome in the Roman legions. You had then, at 380 AD, Christianity becomes an official state religion of the Roman Empire. This is after Decius first legalized it before then. But then, by 380 AD, Christianity becomes the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Then, by 590 AD, the Roman Catholic Church is formed officially, with Pope Gregory I as its pope. Then later, by 1054 AD, the East-West Schism occurs within the church, creating the Eastern Orthodox Church and Catholic Church becoming two separate entities. And this is, within the Roman Empire. Okay, now, because the Roman Empire lasted into the Middle Ages. So now, in the form of the Byzantine Empire, and the Eastern Roman Empire, I should say, by 1119 AD, the Templar Knights are founded during the Crusades, with their headquarters at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And they are thought to be a big part of the origins of Freemasonry, with much of their symbology and customs incorporated into that secret society. Along with this, the Stonemasons Guild, originating in England and spreading throughout Europe during medieval times, being another major contributing factor to that secret society. By medieval times, many royals become Masons. So, the Templars lasted from 1119 AD, when they were founded, to 1312 AD, when they were broken up, when many of their members were driven underground. And many of them are thought to have played a key role in the creation of these secret societies. Well, go figure. So the royals kept their membership largely in secret in most cases. So King James splits from Catholicism and establishes the Church of England during the medieval period. The same King James whose scribes wrote the so-called King James Bible, named for his namesake, but it wasn't really written by him. It was written by scribes because people were largely illiterate back then. So the scribes were likely not Masons, as I'm sure God would not allow for such a thing to take place because his word is enduring, and he's not going to let the wrong people have allowed his word to endure so long. So now we come to, and this is all just talking about the West here. All that I've just been speaking on has to do with the West, and only the West so far. Now we come to the late medieval times and the Renaissance period. By this point, mercantile and banking classes rise to prominence, and many of their members begin to join secret societies. Now, this is throughout the Renaissance, at the very end of medieval times, the medieval era. This is the Renaissance period. We're talking about, Galileo, Da Vinci, that time period. Many of these merchants and these banking classes begin to join these secret societies, which, help them begin to take root and actually become a major factor in the background of, the different movements that began to take root in Europe at this time. So keep that in mind. Now we come to the Victorian period, okay? So by the 1600s, 1600s, which is the Renaissance going into the colonial periods, you begin to see this taking off because, again, like I've just mentioned, you have the mercantile classes and the banking classes beginning to rise to prominence, and many of their members begin to join these secret societies, just now taking root. By 1717, at the beginning of the 1700s, basically, in the Victorian period, 1717, the first official, meaning, out in the open, the first official Masonic lodge is established in England. Okay, so now we're at the point where these secret societies are now more out in the open. They're beginning to establish lodges in Europe. All right. Now we know that during the colonial period and up toward the end of the American Revolution, we know the forefathers were part of secret societies. We know this already. We know our country was founded by these people. So we know about all that. So that's what brought the New World into the fold as far as, members of secret societies in key positions running the land, running the nation. But also, in 1776, that wasn't only a declaration of independence in the United States, but on May 1st of 1776, Adam Weishaupt, a philosopher in what is now Germany, founded the Bavarian Illuminati in Bavaria. The Bavarian Illuminati, founded on May 1st, 1776. Okay? By this point, France and Italy also had lodges established, such as the Italian Grand Orient Lodge in Italy, and other such lodges. So now we have lodges taking root all over Europe out in the open. Now they're being built and out in the open, okay? So people know of these places now. They know about these places, whereas before, It truly was a truly secret society where signs and symbols were recognized by the members, but you didn't really have lodges being built out in open society until you until about 1717, early Victorian period. All right. So now you at this point have Freemasonry, these secret societies spreading to the New World in North America, as the Treaty of Paris was what ended the American Revolution and created this nation, and the founding fathers were members of the order of Freemasonry. So now, with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, now you have it spreading to the New World. But aside from just that, you even have it spreading to Oceania. Oceania is Australia and New Zealand. That's the continent called Oceania. In 1820, it spreads to Oceania, and I'm talking about Masonry. It spreads to Oceania with the Australian Social Lodge, number 260 IC, the letters IC, 260 IC, which was established by men of the then British military. So, knowing what we know about Oceania, it was a colony of the British. So, British military men established the first lodge of Freemasonry called the Australian Social Lodge, number 260 IC. So then you have that. So there's that. So now in Europe, as this is all going on, you begin to really see the establishment and then infiltration, key word being infiltration, because remember what I was talking about a little earlier, the banking and mercantile classes back in the Renaissance period at the end of medieval times, the Renaissance. During the Renaissance, the mercantile and banking class really began to rise to prominence in Europe. So that caused, in the colonial period, many of these central banks to be established, such as the Bank of England, which was created at the end of the 1600s. It was created July 27th, 1694. During the reign of King James II was when the Bank of England was established, which was England's central bank. So you begin to see the subversion and infiltration of the central banks of Europe. So they begin to control the issuance of currency. And thus, Western nations, starting in Europe, but ending with the USA by 1913, upon Woodrow Wilson establishing the Federal Reserve Act, bringing the United States under the control of a central bank called the Federal Reserve, just in time for World War I, which was a massive depopulation and money-making scheme, and brought in the League of Nations, which was the precursor to today's current UN, which, of course, existed just prior to World War II. And Western money interests of the banking elites and wealthy industrialists sought to rein in Russia, of which they didn't have any control over, and sent money to assist in the creation of not only the USSR upon the First World War ending, well, really right before it, if you count the revolution that they had in 1917, But they also later created Nazi Germany, which they did by a combo of the Western central banks helping him to rise to power, among also wealthy American industrialists, like I'm sure you're familiar with Standard Oil, the Bush family, Standard Oil, the Bush family. They gave money to old Adolf over there too. But here's the thing. The plans to rein in Russia by creating the USSR through giving them all this banker money from the West had ultimately failed, and they failed for the reason that Stalin had purged the Trotskyite faction, who was there from the beginning with Lenin, in helping to establish the Soviet Union. But upon Stalin creating his regime, his dictatorship, and purging out the Trotskyites, the plans to rein in the USSR had failed, by which point that was when the Western banksters began to fund Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Why? Well, because they seen it as a way to kill two birds with one stone. They wanted to use Nazi Germany to help rein in Russia, and weaken Russia, but also, to play them both off against each other as yet another way to have a grand money-making scheme through the Second World War, a big money-making scheme like World War I, yet another, and even worse, depopulation event, and another way to remake the world closer and closer to their ultimate end game that they wanted, which was an NWO. But this is just the West I'm talking about. The East has its own plans for a new world order. When I get to them, I'm going to discuss their basically path that they've been on in great detail, like I've been doing here with the West. But anyways, Adolf was not controlled by the central bankers upon his taking power. Now, I'm going to explain why he was wishy-washy. Yes, he did take money from the Western industrialists and bankers, central bankers. Yes, he did. But he quickly turned on them. He turned on the Western elites by his anti-Semitic ideology and going after the Jays, and you know what I mean by the Jays. He turned on the Jays, and he ultimately spoke against them and called them, rich bankers, and they were the reason why Germany lost World War I, and so on and so forth. He took money from the same people he ended up turning on, and then, he basically became something that couldn't be controlled. So the West, once again, they had to try to rein Russia in, but this time they didn't succeed in their passive-aggressive approach of giving the USSR Western aid and Western money to fight the Nazis. See, they thought that this would cozy up to Stalin and cause Stalin to come back and, be buddy-buddy and, and make concessions and allow there to be some sort of a Western-controlled central bank. But I'll go into that when I talk about the East. That failed. It didn't work with the passive-aggressive approach. But after ending World War II and defeating Hitler and fascism, a new conflict had arisen called the Cold War. Now, the goals of the West in the Cold War, although they now created the UN, being the direct successor of the League of Nations that they had between World War I and II, the UN was created, but they still didn't have control over the East. They didn't have control over Eurasia. Not full control, no. You see, they tried to get the USSR pulled back into the fold, but it failed. It failed, and it failed miserably. So the Cold War became all about bankrupting and collapsing the Soviet Union, which they actually succeeded in doing. And in the 1990s, they decided to try it again, to fully dominate Russia. And how did they try that? Well, the desperate, bankrupt, collapsed successor states of the USSR all were extremely debt-ridden and were in horrible need of money. They were extremely cash-strapped and in deep, deep debt. The Russian people will never forget what happened to them in the 90s. Nor really would anybody else in the Soviet Union. If you ask them about how horrible the 90s were, they would tell you. Well, then these oligarchs, what they did was all the former state-owned industries under the communist regime that had existed as the Soviet regime, upon collapsing, you had people that were in control of these former state-run industries starting to sell everything off. They started to literally sell off their former country. They sold out their country just so they could get rich at the expense of their people. And the West was using this as a means to an end by which they could come in there and directly influence the domestic policies and politics of Russia and bring Russia back into the fold. But powerful politicians in Russia basically put a stop to that. You know, things were starting to go really downhill for them, but you had people like Putin, like Medvedev, and very other patriot type people within Russia put a firm end to that, and they put a stop to it, really, and they turned things around in such a dynamic way that if you were to see Russia in the 90s and then see how it is now, oh man, it's like night and day. It's like night and day. It's like night and day. Russia is experiencing an economic boom right now. Even after cutting off energy supplies to the West, even though there's sanctions against them, they're experiencing an economic boom and even a bumper crop. I mean, man, they're doing really good right now. The value of their ruble financially, they're doing well. The value of their ruble has increased. Also, they're the second biggest holder of precious metals after China in the world. They're extremely good with their money. Their foreign debt is extremely low for a developed nation. It's only $250 billion in U.S. dollars. That's what they owe. $250 billion. While we, on the other hand, owe trillions. And the other Western nations are pretty bad off, too. Nothing like we are, but they're pretty damn bad off. So you really now are beginning to see a really, you know, a massive, drastic, just dynamic difference between the East and the West. And the chasm is only growing ever wider between the two. But you have all these different instances where there's overlap between, you know, East and West and their different interactions and, you know, how they've tried to shake each other off of each other's backs. And, you know, there's a lot of different dynamics involved in all this. Like even back in World War II, the Reichsbank in Germany, it was actually taken full control over by Hitler in 1937, just to show you that Hitler didn't tolerate these Western central bankers. He also persecuted secret societies. Hitler took over the Reichsbank, which was put directly under his control in 1937. In 1937. So, also in fascist Italy, they also did similar, but earlier. They had taken over their central bank in 1926. In 1926, they had introduced their their banking laws of 1926, which stipulated that it was to be placed under direct regime control of the fascist regime in Italy. So now you have these two fascist nations, Germany and Italy, though during World War I, they were under direct central banker control. In World War II, they shook it off. They shook it off. Yes, they took money before World War II, and that's how they came to power, but they made convenient enemies for everybody else because they shook off control of these central banks and secret societies, which they all persecuted. The Germans and Italians persecuted secret societies in their respective totalitarian states. But after the war, you had Russia, who fought throughout World War II, moving all throughout Eastern Europe to get to Berlin eventually. You had them not being willing to relinquish control over the territories that they had basically taken control of during the war. And also now they had nuclear weapons and they had this humongous army. So it's not like the West could go in there and directly take control over Russia. After Russia, although they had been weakened, the West tried to finesse them by giving them enormous aid packages. 300,000 Studebaker trucks alone were given to Russia. Those trucks, for the logistical reason alone, is what allowed Russia to carry out these gargantuan offensives against the Nazis. Had it not been for the Western aid packages, Russia may not have won. Or if they did win, it would have only been due to the fact that the attrition just would have gotten so bad inside of Russian borders on the Germans that the Germans would have likely just pulled out on their own. But the Russians wouldn't have been able to follow them all the way back to Germany. They would have just probably had like the Iran-Iraq war, where, these two sides, Iran and Iraq, threw everything they had at each other in a humongous war of attrition. But neither side really gained a whole bunch of territory. It was just a lot of people ended up dying for little to nothing. So you could have had a similar situation develop in the Soviet Union during World War II, but because the Western aid packages were so gracious, what they were trying to do was finesse Stalin to get him to acquiesce to Western demands, but he wouldn't do it. He took the aid, but he never acquiesced to Western demands. Instead, he started the Cold War, which didn't end until the Soviet Union collapsed due to all the debt and no way to keep up in the arms race because they couldn't pay all the debt, all the money that they had basically pissed away into this arms race. They couldn't pay it back. That's why they collapsed. Because if the Soviet Union didn't exist, then the Soviet Union no longer legally was saddled with all this debt. Sure, the successor states didn't start off that well because they were cash strapped from the collapse happening. But the Soviet Union had to dissolve in order to get out of debt, basically. If that makes any sense. I hope it does. So that was how we got largely to where we are today. Now, you'd also see things happening like a big thing was the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration back in 1926, named after Arthur Balfour, who was it had to do with the establishment of a national home for the J people in Palestine. The Jays. It had to do with an establishment of a national home for the Jays in the Mandate of Palestine, which officially was over with. It expired on May 14th, 1948, just after World War II ended in 1945. By May 14, 1948, the British mandate over Palestine expired, allowing for the declaration of the State of Israel. Israel was established. So That's another thing that contributed to the modern situation in the West. Because Israel, even though it's in the Mid-E, it is still considered a Western nation by and large. Now, of course, they have a big say over what occurs in the West. Because remember, a lot of these elite banksters, they're the synagogue of Satan. Those are the Jays that say they are Jays but are not. Okay? So a lot of them have sway over the Western central banks that are in each Western nation. But now I'm going to shift to the East, now that I've basically covered the West. So the East is a bit different than the West in a lot of different ways. Now, you have like a lot of different subsets of the East, okay? Now, you have a big part of the Eastern tradition having to do with Confucianism in China and in the Chinese Empire. And the origin of Confucianism can be traced all the way back to 551 to 479 BC. Just before China became one unified China, the Chinese nation, Chinese Empire, in 221 BC, which came a few hundred years later. But before that, you had Confucius, who is the Chinese philosopher who started Confucianism. So that would have a lot to do with the whole Chinese state of mind and thought, and even the Chinese secret societies. They had their own secret societies that would come about a bit later. So basically, I'm going to go over that real quick here. See, in China, they had three main secret societies turn up a bit later down the road. You had the Ang Yi secret society. You had the Triads, which later turned into a criminal syndicate. And then you had the Tiandi Hui. The Tiandi Hui, they were created in 1761 as originally a mutual aid society, which eventually turned into an anti-Qing dynasty resistance movement because they wanted to reestablish the Ming dynasty. They were Ming dynasty loyalists trying to restore the Ming dynasty. Now, by the 19th century, the Tiandi Hui had turned into the Hongmen, 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 which are sometimes referred to as the Chinese Freemasons. They're not Freemasons. They have no relations to the actual Western Freemasons. They're just called the Chinese Freemasons as a way to equate their ways and values as something being somewhat similar. As far as being a secret society and how they operate, they mostly were driven overseas and ended up in Western nations. Now, some of the Hongmen would later become triads, which became a criminal gang. Now, that's one thing about these Asiatic secret societies. A lot of these organized crime syndicates trace their roots directly to these Asiatic secret societies. The Yang Yi is mostly overseas as well. They were also driven overseas. Now understand that in today's China, the CCP has banned and outlawed all secret societies. The CCP is the ultimate power in China. They control the banks. There's no private central bank in China. The CCP owns the Central Bank of China. But I'll go more into that a bit later. But even before the CCP outlawed secret societies, the Qing dynasty itself outlawed secret societies, which is what drove these secret societies overseas. That's what drove them overseas. So they ended up in the West by and large, but also other parts of the world, but mostly in the West. These Angyi triads and Tian de Hui, aka Hongmen, the Tian de Hui in 1761 became the Hongmen in the 19th century. So they were all driven overseas, okay? Now, in China, there is only one direct connection to the Hongmen remaining, and that is the Li Gong Party, which is actually a party, or I'm sorry, the Zhigong Party, which they have one seat, only one seat, and they're submissive to the CCP, so they have no power. They're just there for show. It's called the Zhigong Party, and it traces its origins to the Hongmen. But the Zhigong Party has no power whatsoever. They're totally submissive to the CCP, and they have one seat in the Chi-Com Politburo. So it has one member with one seat in the Chi-Com Politburo. They're totally submissive to the CCP, so they have no power in China. They had to basically become a political party so as not to be swept up by the laws that go against secret societies. That was how they escaped persecution. And the Zhigong Party is actually a socialist party because you cannot be another political party in China unless you're either some sort of a socialist party that's approved by the CCP to give the appearance that there is diversity when there's really not, because they're ultimately subservient to the CCP at the end of the day. But you have to be part of a socialistic party, which the Zhigong Party is, and they have to be submissive to the CCP, who is the ultimate power of China. So those are some of the secret societies of China, but they were outlawed long before the CCP even had their laws against them by the Qing dynasty. Okay, so back to China here. Now, if you recall, in the late 1800s, the West began to aggress upon China. They began to seize coastal Chinese cities as de facto colonies, calling them trade cities by these different Western nations. They got leases over certain cities along the Chinese coast. Although these Western nations were not big or powerful enough to take over all of China, they bullied China and obtained coastal trade cities. Hong Kong is one such city, and their lease expired in 1997, whereby the CCP regained control of it. But the thing is, in the 90s, the USA was a superpower back in the 90s, okay? We were a superpower in the 90s. China hadn't yet fully modernized the way they needed to dethrone us as the world superpower like they have now in the past 5 years. China wasn't strong enough back then yet. They weren't back then strong enough yet. That's why they never had a war over Hong Kong with the British, because they knew we would back the British. They knew we would back the British. So, the Chinese also needed to steal industrial secrets from us, and they needed our help with building factories in China so that they could use those factories by which to gain even more vital knowledge about manufacturing in order that they could build their own manufacturing base, which they did. They eventually did. And they rapidly modernized in the 90s. China already had a military-industrial complex well before then, by the 50s, but as far as their civilian economic sector, they needed to become viable as far as a manufacturing and trading nation in order that they obtain the funds, the funds by which to build themselves into the global superpower that they are today. So in the 90s, they had to play nice, is what I'm saying. In other words, because it benefited them to do so. It benefited them to bite their tongue and pretend to like globalism so that they could steal everything they could from the West. It benefited them to do so. So they had to bite their tongue, play nice, allow the British to have their little Hong Kong until their lease was up, and then get it back. So they, in the 90s, they bit their tongue, they stole what they could from us, they got the crown jewels, they modernized, and then they built themselves into the world superpower. But I'm going to get to all that. So, as far as Indian relations with Russia go back a pretty long ways. All right? We're talking as far back as Afanasy Nikitin, who had traveled overland to India via Persia, an overland route, from 1468 to 1472. That was when he made his travels to India. And in 1696, that year is the year that's seen Peter the Great establish formal trading relations with the Mughal dynasty emperor Aurangzeb. Making sure I'm pronouncing that properly. Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. So, for a while, the Russian Empire and the Indians had a formal trading relationship. But then, in 1707, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in India opened the way for the British to start gradually taking over India. So by 1757, the British defeated Bengal and the French in a war that they had there, whereby the East India Trading Company had then, by 1772, succeeded in taking power over all of India, the Indian subcontinent. So, in the 1840s, that led to a conflict with the, it was called the Anglo-Sikh Wars, Sikh as in S-I-K-H. The Anglo-Sikh Wars in the 1840s solidified, meaning it kept full control over India by defeating the Sikhs and in the 1840s and allowing the British to basically take the Indian monarchy abroad, raise them in Britain, and basically anglicize them, and then send them back to India as a means by which to retain control over the people of India. So, if you all wanted to know about that, that's pretty interesting. I found that interesting because India is a large part of the East overall, but the West in the 1700s and then formally by the 1840s obtained full control over India in a span of some roughly 80 or so odd years. So then, you had Russia going through what it went through with its revolution. This was about the time World War I had ended. Then you had a period of time during the reign of Stalin where Stalin had basically not had any sorts of real relations with India, with British India. And Stalin was against Gandhi. Stalin had no love for Gandhi. But upon Stalin's death In 1955, after Stalin died in 1953, there was a reestablishment of extremely strong, firm relations between the USSR and the then independent India. This is after India achieved independence at the end of the 40s. So, by 1955, India, although considered a non-aligned state, they weren't communist and they weren't for the West, in official terms. They did have strong relations with the Soviet Union, who basically became a client state of the USSR. India became a client state of the USSR. They began to buy Soviet military hardware in humongous numbers. Tanks, aircraft, everything. So now we go back to China. In 1912, at the end of the Qing dynasty in 1912, Sun Yat-sen became the president of the Republic of China. China became a republic in 1912. And Tang Xiaoyi was the first premier. And then you had Chiang Kai-shek following them in 1925 until 1949, when the communists took control of mainland China. After the Chinese Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek was the then de facto ruler of the Republic of China. Also, this took place during World War II and into the later years of the Chinese Civil War, before the communists under Mao Zedong took control of mainland China in 1949. So what does that mean? Well, Chiang Kai-shek was being cozied up to by the West. The West was increasingly supporting Chiang Kai-shek. And, the West thought that was their boy. They thought that was their man in China, that they were going to rely upon to spread their Western central banking scheme to China. But Mao Zedong had his long march, and all of that completely and totally failed. And Chiang Kai-shek in the Republic of China was forced to flee to Formosa, which is also Taiwan. So the Republic of China was basically maintained on the island of Taiwan. So that ended up being that with the whole China situation. Of course, you had Taiwan in the Western fold, but now that also being that Taiwan is an island, and the first island chain, as they call it, you also have Japan, another island. Now let's talk about them. They're traditionally an Eastern nation, and their truly first trading relations that they had with the West was that they traded with the Roman Empire, and evidence of this was Roman glass products, like glass beads and such, from the Roman Empire were found in Japan by archaeologists. Proof that the ancient Roman Empire not only traded with the Empire of China along the Silk Road, but they'd also had trading by sea with Japan, with ancient Japan. So Japan, eventually was cut off from trade with Rome, and the next group of people that would then trade with them would be the Dutch during the colonial period. But then they were isolated again. And then, 200 years after their last trading with the Dutch, you had Commodore Matthew Perry sailing into Tokyo Bay to reestablish trade with Japan on July 8th, 1853. So, what does that mean? That means that Japan, in order to not be bullied and intimidated, had to quickly modernize. Japan was one of the first truly modernized Asian nation states. Now, I wouldn't say that they fully westernized, as in they didn't accept everything of the Western culture. And that becomes obvious as they had their Bushido Code, which even lasted all the way into World War II, where their forces would do banzai charges and commit seppuku, if you know what seppuku is. They carried on their samurai traditions into World War II. They didn't really become fully westernized until after World War II. They also controlled the issuance of their own currency. And the Yakuza, I guess you could say, would be the only true Japanese secret society to have really ever existed. Because Yakuza, which became an organized crime syndicate, sort of like the Chinese triads, the Yakuza was also a sort of like mutual aid sort of society, or a do-gooder society that eventually morphed into a criminal syndicate in Japan. And the triads, they were established in or around 1612. And that was when their members began to be noticed by their general appearances, be it their hairstyling or their, behaviors and things like that in the 1600s, early 1600s. And then they morphed into a criminal syndicate. But that was later down the road, more into the modern era. But that was roughly about colonial times. So Japan was a traditionally Eastern nation who didn't even become really Western into the Western camp until after World War II. And India, upon gaining its independence, rejoined the East. Remember, they had been under British rule, so they were de facto under Western control. But India went full Eastern after they gained their independence, because the Reserve Bank of India, which was actually established earlier during the British rule, the Reserve Bank of India was brought back to heel under the Indian government. So the Indian government took control again of their central bank and put it directly back under their oversight, meaning that the Indian government was basically in full control. Although they did grant them some autonomy, the Indian regime still had the ultimate authority on the actions and activities of their central bank and the issuance of their currency. And lately, Modi in India has been really reining them in and taking away some of that autonomy that they've previously been allowed by the Indian regime. So you see this trend in the East whereby you have these central banks in Eastern nations that are under direct government control. Whereas in the West, the difference is that the Western central banks control the regimes. So, yeah, and secret societies have more leeway too and everything else. Now, back to the issue of the USSR and Russia, even the Russian Empire before that. Here's the thing about them. At one point, there were Western influences in Russia, in the Russian Empire, such as you had Catherine the Great, who was the empress in Russia in the 1800s, who had actually expelled secret societies from Russia. Now, the story behind this is that Freemasonry came to Russia from 1732 to 1734, which was brought to Russia by foreign officers of German descent who created a Grand Lodge in St. Petersburg, Russia, in the city's German quarter. Due to suspecting that there was foul play and a coup plot in progress created by the Masons that were in Russia, Catherine the Great purged all Freemasons from Russia, by 1785, they were all completely gone from Russia. Now, that was when they had made their attempt with the Trotskyites to bring them back into the fold, but it failed because Stalin made that fail, as I've told you all. So, you've seen them once, establishing themselves, the Western secret societies, to try to bring Russia into the fold, but prematurely they were kicked out. They didn't even get to try anything. So then they tried to bring Russia into the fold in 1917 with the Trotskyites, who failed. Then they tried some finesse during World War II. They tried to finesse the Russians, get them to acquiesce, by giving them all this aid and everything else during World War II. A war by which they, directly and indirectly created by funding the fascists who were to go after Russia, playing them both off against each other while simultaneously finessing the Russians by giving them aid to fight the war with. But it failed. Stalin didn't take the bait. So Stalin kept Russia in the eastern camp. And in the 90s, you see the West trying to bring Russia to heel again, but that failed too, because then you had people like I said earlier, like Medvedev, your Putins, your other very patriotic Russian peoples rising up and putting their foot down on that. And obviously, Russia has not been brought to heel to the West, obviously. Now, in today's Russia, yes, under the freedom of religion clause in the Russian Constitution, yeah, the Freemasons are technically allowed to be there, but here's the thing about that. They're under extreme FSB surveillance, and their members are not allowed to hold key posts in the regime of the Russian Federation. I don't know about local postings, but I know that their members are not allowed to be in the key positions in the Russian Federation's federal regime. So that says something. So also in China, you have the CCP there as the ultimate power in China. They will have no competition from anybody, and the CCP has full control over the central bank in China, and all other banks for that matter, but they control the issuance of their own currency. They have no competition from anybody in China. And you also now in India, you see Modi pulling what little autonomy their Indian central bank had. He's pulling it away from them as he clamps down even further on them. They were granted by the regime in India a little bit of autonomy, but the government's pulling that away. They're taking that autonomy away. So you see the East is aligning in the BRICS nations, headed mostly by China with their Shanghai Cooperation Organization and their Belt and Road Initiative, but also Russia. Like I said, not to denigrate Russia, but they seem like the junior partner to China, who has all these big, schemes and plots and NGOs and other organizations. China has their own NGOs, they have their own organizations that are under the control of the CCP. And the CCP has been infiltrating the West for some time now, literally turning Western institutions against the people of the West. And even financial institutions. CCP members are beginning to take key positions, much as I've stated in a past live I've done about this very issue. So the East and the West are both two very different blocks. While yes, the West did gain control over Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, the East is subverting the West and starting to gain control over them. Now, as I've said, back in the 90s, you had China biting its tongue and playing nice with the West, pretending to possibly be okay with globalism just so they could get the factories and expertise and steal the crown jewels of the West. They were talking out of two sides of their mouth, folks, just so they could get what they wanted out of the deal. And so they could shaft us in the West for everything we had and build themselves into the most powerful nation the world has ever seen or will have known, ever. So nowadays, you have, yes, you still have these Jesuits who originally came from a Basque nobleman named Loyola, or also known as the Society of Jesus. You have these Kabbalists, these Masons, these secret societies who have all infiltrated the Western banking establishment. You have them running things in the West, but in the East, you just don't have that. And I think I've articulated extremely well why that's the case. Because for one thing, in nations where secret societies are either extremely marginalized or totally outlawed, and also in nations where the regimes control the issuance of the money, like in the East, you have a situation where the political classes and the uber rich of the East, they're the elites of the East. They hold all the power in the East. Whereas in the West, you have your uber rich and industrialists controlling the regimes when it was supposed to be the people electing the regimes. And you just don't have that in the West. In the West, you have it to where these secret societies and uber-rich bankster gangsters, they run things in the West. The banking class, the industrial titan class, the corporate class, they run everything in the West. Whereas in the East, these regimes and their cronies, these uber-rich of the East, they're the ones that run things. And the regimes of the East have the ultimate control over the issuance of the currency, which means that they have the ultimate control, and they're the powers that be in the Eastern nations. That's why you see the rise of BRICS. That's why you see them rising to compete directly against the Western Economic Forum in the West. They're not truly the World Economic Forum. They'd like to be, but they're not. They're the Western Economic Forum. The BRICS nations, ultimately, when the East dominates the West in World War III, you will see them morph into some format or some form of a new UN. They'll morph into a new UN, like UN 2.0. And it'll be an Eastern-dominated UN. Because Western globalism was ultimately played. They've been played by the East. Just so the East could get all the benefits of globalism, all the concessions of globalism, to build themselves up, just so they could turn right around and knife the West in the back. Because that's exactly what's going to happen. The Bible is even clear that that's going to happen. The Bible is clear. Look what happens to Babylon. So, that being said, the East and the West are two very, very different entities. And yes, although they've done business with each other and have sit-downs with each other, there are also times when they clash, and there's even times where they go to war with each other. World War III is going to be an East versus West conflict. And the East is going to come out victorious because the East has played chess, and they've played chess very well. They've formed their alliances to cut the West out completely. They've created their own systems, their own economic systems, apart from the SWIFT system of the West, by which they can do their business transactions while cutting out the petrodollar, the middleman, America, the West, Western Europe, the EU. They have the FSPS system of Russia. They have the SIPS system of China. They don't need SWIFT. Although they can do business on SWIFT, they don't need it. They've largely cut us out, folks. They've cut us out. The East and the West are two very, very different systems, sets of elites, and states of mind. The Chinese and the Russians and the Indians, they all have their own classes of uber rich. I told you in a previous live that China has more billionaires than even the United States has. They've knocked us down to the number 2 position. Because if you add the mainland Chinese billionaires of 698 billionaires, 698 billionaires, to the 71 that live in Hong Kong, which has been retaken by China in 1997, that gives you a grand total in China alone of some 769 billionaires. There's 724 in the United States. So they have a good handful of more billionaires than we do. India, surprisingly, has over 200 billionaires. I never would have thought that. And Russia has 117, which isn't too bad considering their population. And of course, China and Russia have trillionaires, largely in the form of their leaders, such as their national leaders, their current sitting national leaders, but also some of the top cronies in the CCP that have more than likely took their fair share, I'll just put it, of the spoils that go along with being a CCP elite. So the Eastern elites are every bit as wealthy and even more powerful because of their military might, their industrialization and humongous manufacturing base, and more, and numbers and technology. They're more powerful than the West. The East is. And they have every bit as much wealth, if not more, concentrated in the East than there is in the West. The reason why I would say they have more, look at the amount of gold that China has, and also Russia, but China especially. 6,400 plus tons. The plus means that they're estimated to have a lot more, but they'll only admit to having 6,400 tons. That's what they'll admit to. That's what they'll officially admit to having. But people think they have a lot more than that. Russia, it's over 2,000 tons. While we give the official figure of 800 tons for America, but in reality, it's gold-covered tungsten. Gold-covered tungsten, like was found in Fort Knox recently. In fact, I saved that video. I saved that to my Things Relating to America playlist. Things Relating to America and China, I'm sorry. Yeah, I've saved it to that playlist. Tungsten gold-covered bars, gold-covered tungsten bars. Because of the weight of tungsten, that's why they did that. Because it weighs pretty heavy, pretty close to the weight of gold. Yeah. So the East has rapidly grown in power and wealth, and they're going to supplant the West. As we sold China the rope that they will use to hang us with. And that's exactly what's been happening and what will happen. Not too far off in the future. Let me see who's all in here. Who's all in here? Hey, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed my presentation tonight. Yep, they're very, very different, the East and the West. I've just shown you in great detail why they're different. They're not, we would already be under a one world system now if they weren't different, if they were all under control of the same person. Remember, folks, these Eastern and Western elites, they're not unified, and the East is going to destroy the West. And the Eastern elites will only then be unified under the beast as the 10 victorious kings over the West in World War III will be they who give their power to the beast and reign with him for 1 hour in biblical time, which is just a matter of months. And then the one world government will fall apart. The one world regime will be no more. It'll start to crack and fissure and break apart. Plus the wrath of God will be coming down too by that point. So these 10 kings are going to be Eastern kings who will be victorious over the West in a third world war. China and Russia being two of the strongest out of the 10, obviously. And they're going to destroy the West, and the facts don't lie. Everything is aligning for that to happen now. Everything is aligning for that very thing to happen now. You see the Chinese and Russian militaries and the militaries of their allies all moving into position. They've been getting ready for a world war, whereas we've been castrating our armed forces. So have the Europeans. There's no way in hell the West can stand up against the East. And the Western elites, they'll pay for it too. They're going to suffer the consequences of no longer having a power base which will be there to protect them. If you don't have security forces, for one thing, you have no way to impose your will on anybody. And another thing, you have nobody there left to protect you from the Chinese, from the Russians, who have all the power now. So that's just the reality of it. So I just want to say thank you to all who came. Appreciate that. Thank you, Rebecca, for handling that. I don't like trolls and shills. You all be blessed. You all have a great night.